Thank you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this final session, panel 4. And the topic is academic and executive education, growing best practice, meeting standards. We've got a very experienced panel here. Professor Siraj Sait, who is the Director, Center for Islamic Finance and Communities at the University of East London. Very experienced, not only in this area, but also in terms of your previous designations. Yeah. And I've already introduced Daud, Vicary. So once again, vast experience in this area of Islamic finance, previously in accounting and auditing, but now in his new hat of education. Well, not new, newish. Yeah. And of course, we have George Littlejohn, who's a senior advisor to CC, that is the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment. And George and I go back many, many years, and I'm sure he will allude to that in another manifestation. So I think we'll go straight into the topic, and I'll ask Professor Siraj to say his opening statement.
Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah.
I think we can frame this curriculum development and delivery debate in rather simplistic terms. What are we going to teach in terms of Islamic finance? Whom are we going to teach? And how are we going to teach it? Of course, it's not all about teaching. It is about first learning and teaching. But some of the main issues have already been covered. We've said that we need to look at what are the minimum standards, what are the kind of core competencies we need, and quite apart from the basic skills that the graduates or the professionals require, whether it be drafting, accounting, or negotiating, the host of other skills that might be required. And this is where we need to step out and think about what we're going to teach. I found it very interesting when Sheikh Haitham was speaking about the role of a mujtahid or an Islamic scholar. It's not only the narrow technicalities or what is Sharia compliant, but much more broader. Because just as an Islamic scholar is called upon to play a variety of roles, so do Islamic finance experts or professionals. So we know that Islamic finance has taken a particular life of its own, that much of the work is transactional and that you have private projects. But in fact, the reality of Islamic finance across the board is much more broader. So in the work that I do with the United Nations, for example, the questions are, how can we use Islamic finance for development? How do you use Islamic finance in conflict-torn countries? What do we do about urbanization, looking at not just mega projects, but integrated projects that exist? Poverty alleviation, sustainable development goals. So when Baroness Warsi talked about human rights and Islamic finance, how does Islamic finance look as a right that people have to access, to participate, and to deliver? So I found it very interesting when somebody put it this way. The Islamic finance has three components to it. The Islamic is the sort of normative, the finance is the sort of operational and professional, but the ethical approach is what makes it important. However, I have a lot of trouble when I talk to people outside our incestuous circle. So when I go to the UN and I speak to other colleagues over there, they ask me, well, you do make this point that Islamic finance is a sort of continuum of responsible financing. But please, could you tell me, what is the difference between Islamic finance, ethical finance, responsible finance, and green finance? Talk to me about the components. And talk to me critically about what are the weaknesses that you're trying to plug. Now, we might have theorized Islamic finance to some degree, doctrinal, and we've even developed projects, but we haven't conceptualized well enough where we are going, what we are doing, and so on. At University of East London, we have a little bit of experience in dealing with this because we are the coordinators of the Global Islamic Mechanism within the UN system, where we look at how we can apply Muslim customary and Islamic principles in the development process. We have had dozens of training programs across the world. And this is where we are called upon to show how we can be both. We raise a question about performance. How does performance in terms of Islamic finance look any different from performance in the conventional finance sections? Now, therefore, our curriculum has not only to have the nut and bolts, which are the predictable ones, but as our ambition grows, as the industry matures over needs to ask what Mehmet called about the critical thinking that is required. Now, this will all change if we just think about who are our stakeholders. It's not merely students. We know by the very nature of our description, the undergraduate, the postgraduate, the doctoral, the executive education. We're talking about training running into capacity development. We've talked about different stakeholders. But we very easily forget a whole range of people in this multi-stakeholder. We talk about women, and rightly so. When Naira asked me to contribute to her now much famous report, I said we need to talk about financial inclusion and participation as part of governance, going beyond regulation. And we need to talk about gender. But not just women in terms of leadership roles, as much as it might be the most important, but women at all levels and all types of participation. Both in terms of the industry, but also outside, as consumers. Think therefore outside the box. Think about how much a stake do ordinary people who actually use Islamic finance products, whether it be microfinance or other forms of finance that are involved. What kind of role do they have in development of the product? So transparency in governance is not merely about structures and institutions. It starts at the critical thinking that's available, from the point of view of our development partners, interventions. Some of my experiences recently where these questions have come up, where I was a chair of the UN Evaluation Commission on UN projects, where there was a demand for Islamic finance, but the myth surrounding it, somehow the sense that we can only access our knowledge, for example, in Somalia, writing the laws over there, only through Sharia scholars. Empowerment through knowledge is to demystify, is to make simple. And I like, therefore, what Sheikh said, and many of you have said, understanding the basic text. How we deliver Islamic finance, again, very, very important. And I think we are rather primitive still in the way we teach. We have curriculums loaded with anecdotes, doctrines, and so on. Whereas a lot of the world has moved on to tool-based approaches. How do you identify a problem? How do you actually also be problem-solving in the sense of who does what, when, and how? Who's responsible for a variety of things? And that's how the knowledge is actually translated through awareness into practical ways in which a range of stakeholders can practice Islamic finance, but more importantly, be able to deliver on the potential and the promise of Islamic finance, which is transformational. Just think of a statistic. 72% of the Muslims across the world, according to the World Bank, do not have access to conventional finance for a variety of reasons. Worry about interest and the way the banks are structured. How can Islamic finance actually change that? Or does Islamic finance, again, cater only to the elitist, to those who can leverage out its benefits? I think there are some questions. And those questions not only fall in the responsibility of policyholders and business leaders, but students. And therefore, IFES and many of those who are present over here who are asking the questions and interrogating the champions and the visionaries that we have over here is actually a fantastic way forward. And I think this particular model that we have today, and I hope it can be replicated in many ways, almost like a town hall meeting, is important. Bringing together interdisciplinary approaches, getting the broader context, as was said, not just the text, but the context, and finally, using multi-stakeholder. The Islamic finance is not merely about regulators, bankers, academics, policymakers, or researchers. It is about people. Thank you very much. And therefore, the sense of capacity development and education has to be much more broader, and I think it has to start before the universities, but certainly at least at the universities. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Siraj. I think you've raised some very, very interesting and pertinent issues. Suffice to say that the connectivity between Islamic finance and, for instance, the whole halal business concept is very, very stark, very poor. And that alone is a huge opportunity. And I think to a certain extent, the industry is talking to the converter. They're very incestuous, very parochial in that sense. They haven't really gone out in terms of connecting with other stakeholders. There's this whole area of social finance. You mentioned SRI. The SRI movement and the ethical is far, far bigger than the Islamic finance movement in terms of the numbers, So there is a lot of course, there are certain differences, some of them fundamental in terms of the interest issue and all that, but still there needs to be far more interaction in that sort of sense. And of course, other areas of urbanization and empowerment, in terms of financial inclusion, especially
Environment, like you talked about.
Rahno. This is a very important concept, microfinance. So there is, and if curricula can come up and reflect those wider needs, as I said, come up with issues, bring in the problem-solving aspects as well, and the discourse on that. So I'm going to move on to Daud, if you want to make an opening statement in the context of the topic.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Mushtak. I'm going to say something which I didn't think I was going to say. That's why you caught me in a reflective moment. Now, I was looking at the topic of growing best practices, and I think I'm going to do two things in some brief, I hope, brief comments. One is just give a little bit of background of how we're approaching this at INSEAF after 10 years of experience. And there are some things, we've learned some things along the way. And the other aspect of this is how important it is actually, to keep pushing back the boundaries on best practices and sharing. I commented earlier, and I think unfortunately I get 2 bites of the cherry. This is the second panel I've been on. How important collaboration is. And collaboration, I'm fortunate that I collaborate with the University of East London. I collaborate not directly with George, although I'm very happy to collaborate with him, but with CISI, where we're working on another level of IFQ at a higher level, which will be accredited by the FAA, by the way. And this area of collaboration, I think, is absolutely critical as we try to push back the boundaries. And I'll get on to the second point about what has INSEAF learned in its first 10 years. It's learned about collaboration. What it's also learned, and we are a unique institution in that so far, there is no other university on this planet that teaches only Islamic finance. And we do it at a postgraduate level, master's and PhD. And maybe we're just out on a limb and everybody thinks we're crazy. I don't think so, but they may think that. Somebody commented earlier that there's been a particular focus by the government of Malaysia and leadership there to actually focus on doing it in this way. What have we learnt? Well, I can share with you 2 or 3 key things we've learnt along the way. One is, and we haven't learned this, is obvious, I'm not an academic, I'm a former practitioner. And INSEAF is based, if I look at the constitution of our board in terms of the people there, our professional development panel, which is equivalent to the Senate, and our international governing council, those 20 or 30 people who make up those panels, very few of them are academics. Most of them are industry practitioners, they are regulators, they represent the halal industry, they represent minority groups, they represent professional services practitioners. And the whole ethos of INSEAF is about being for the industry, by the industry, and with the industry. One of our major flagship master's programs, the curriculum, is set by the industry. We have to get Ministry of Higher Education approval for that. However, the content is driven directly by focus groups and the industry. And our research programs are driven 95% and funded by the industry. So the whole ethos is about connectivity with the industry. What is also important is that as we've grown and developed, this whole notion of collaboration is key. That Malaysia took the lead by creating something like INSEAF, and the attitude in Malaysia, I think at the regulatory level, at leadership level, political level, and certainly at INSEAF and other levels in Islamic finance, is to share the knowledge and to give back what we've learned along the way. The collaboration with UEL was formed really almost completely by accident, where I just ran into Nora Colton I think she was on a Lord Mayor's tour of Kuala Lumpur a few years back, and we just sat down and it just went zzz. There was just this interaction about, she wanted to do some stuff in Islamic finance, she wanted to hear more about INSEAF, and I said, why don't we do some stuff together? And we're working on that program. The situation with IFQ, and I remember relating this story to George and to other members, 10, 12, 11 years ago when IFQ started, I was on the first review panel, editorial panel to take a look at those standards. I was a practitioner then. And the whole thing's sort of come full circle. IFQ is an excellent qualification, very good entry point, but we need to get something, more, I won't say robust, operating at a higher level. Collaboration is absolutely key, as indeed are meeting standards. We worked with the FAA since their inception 3 years ago, and we're very supportive of their professional standards. In fact, some of our programs comply with it. The programs we're doing with UEL will comply with FAA standards. But I think even more importantly is the recognition that I did a bit of research before this, and forgive my jet lag, but I can read my research here. In Asia and the GCC alone, there are 1,250 institutions offering various levels of academic and executive education. It's very, very important. Some of them are good, and some of them are not so good. And it's very important that we have some level of standards here. At university level, we're going through the process of getting AACSB accreditation. That will put us in the top 5% of universities in the world. It's an internationally, globally recognized standard for business schools. It puts us in the same breath as Harvard Business School or Sloan MIT, although we don't have as much money as those guys do. But we've been working on this for 3 years. We have 2 more years to go, and we've jumped every hurdle. We're unique because they don't know how to think about us, because they've never come across a university that just does Islamic finance. But a lot of the conversations today have been about learning outcomes. How do you demonstrate that they're learning these skills and competencies? It's not the academic education, but it's the softer skills. It's the entrepreneurial skills. It's the risk sharing, the risk knowledge. It's the leadership skills. It's the ethical values. We teach ethics courses at INSEAF, and we get outside experts to talk about it. So that level of accreditation is vital. We need accreditation at the professional level as well, like the accounting profession. I have an accounting qualification, yippee, but it's professionally accredited. But we need the same to make sure that our resources globally are interoperable. If you've got one of these qualifications, if you've got an ACCA, I don't actually, I'm a CPA Australia, but never mind. Very unusual for a British person to have that, but I've got that. If you have an ACCA, it's transferable. You can operate in any number of countries which are recognized. Country recognition is very important. INSEAF, in the last 12 months, we've been recognized as a valid university doing valid courses. Japan, Korea, China, Indonesia, Canada, and the Maldives have joined in and said, you're official. What that means is that those countries now can give grants to students to come and study with us. And that effectively is what that means. Every country has a different view on this. So the idea of both the academic process that we go through and the executive education process we go through, we need to meet standards, and we need to ensure that what we're doing, we collaborate and we operate with industry, and that we trailblaze those standards. What works with us and works very well right now, and I was sharing with Naira, and she's probably gone now, but it'll be published in her report, which I think was a huge fanfare on is it the 1st of December in Bahrain at the WIBC? The article or the piece I wrote there describes something of what about INSEAF is doing, and this will be my final comment. We work at something we're calling the INSEAF Mingle. What this means is that our students get the opportunity, because we're proactive and we're driven by the industry, they go and present to industry. They present their products, their cases, and the industry absolutely loves it. They want exclusivity, they want to buy the products, they want to hire the students. We're facilitating it. We're facilitating through incubator programs, entrepreneurship skills. We're now working on programs which are called action leadership programs, where our students and faculty provide consultancy services to solve problems. A Singaporean bank which has an Islamic finance subsidiary, I can share it with you, OCBC Al Amin, is using us, our students and our faculty, to do a market entry study for that bank to go into a particular country. And they're paying a nominal fee for it, but they're getting fresh and new ideas from people who are perfectly capable of doing this, and they get a look-see at some very talented individuals to say, actually, we might want to hire you later to deliver this program. It's about engagement, it's about collaboration, it's about professional standards. And fortunately, or unfortunately for some, INSEAF is blazing the trail, because we're the first, and we're still the only, after 10 years, only university dedicated to just doing this subject. And I'm not going to rub it in here, but I will.
We do too many things.
Well, you do too many. Thomson Reuters did a study of global research in Islamic finance at the end of last year. 11% of the world's accredited and referenced research in Islamic finance comes from our campus.
Sure.
What they also indicated was that the UK has more programs teaching Islamic finance than Malaysia does. What they failed to mention was, I have more full-time faculty teaching on my campus than the whole UK educational system in Islamic finance.
Thank you, Daud.
Okay.
I'm going to hold back for the moment.
Good.
But suffice to say, I'd love to be a fly on the wall of some of your, lectures and the things. Let me just, in terms of the curricula, in terms of widening the whole proposition in terms of education, I recently advised two young men doing degrees, one at Cambridge and the other one at the University of Cape Town. And what struck me was the topics were completely outside the normal domain. The one was doing in the geography department, looking at the spatial distribution of consumers in Islamic finance, and was using the UK as an example. That is really thinking outside the black box. And that. The other one is from the sociology department at UCT, and trying to apply Wittgenstein's theory of economy and society, and using Africa, Islamic finance in South Africa, and Africa as an example. So, why is it that Western universities is doing this, and not, the universities dedicated to Islamic finance education? Are we too narrow in our curricula in terms of, or is this just a development phase in the evolution of contemporary Islamic finance?
I think the advantage is, I won't say disadvantage, but there a different approach in terms of larger universities offering Islamic finance as opposed to those who dominantly or exclusively offer Islamic finance. I think we look up to the leadership of NCF because it is clearly the world leader, and not only just in the narrow confines, but also quite broadly. But what we see coming out of some of the other universities is linkages of Islamic finance to the kind of things that you talked about, for example, spatial, or whether they be urbanizing, or look at poverty alleviation and things like that. I think it has to be a mix of both. And I take on board what Brother Dawood has mentioned. Our focus should be the industry. But as Nora, who's not here, but who would have said, our university, for example, is driven by the ethos of civic engagement. And therefore, the question really happens to be, so what? So you have a big portfolio, and as far as Islamic finance, what does it do apart from filling certain people's pockets? Where is the transformational aspect, or where's the promise of Islamic Sharia? Where is the value system? In order to do this, we, of course, rely through Shabir and through the Islamic Advisory Board on the industry. But we need to go beyond that. And therefore, the standards are important, but the standards that have been set that favors all stakeholders rather than just the dominant ones.
Okay.
And if I can add briefly to this, take a look at the research topics that our PhD students are. You'd be surprised that some of those things are actually being covered. But I think more importantly, I spent most of the whole day yesterday at another university looking at collaborations around things which are not specifically Islamic finance, but actually are related to concepts of risk sharing, concepts around debt, as opposed to equity, and concepts around Islamic finance and anti-fragility theory. So those kind of ideas are coming through there, but we're building critical mass. We had 13 PhD graduates graduated this year, which is a record number, and some of the topics that they're being encouraged to pursue are not directly related. We've got one guy working on game theory in Islamic finance, okay. and so watch this space. So I think it's a fair critique. But we're getting there, and we're getting there, interesting enough, through collaboration with other entities who have greater resources and greater breadth of spectrum.
I'll come to George now, especially in terms of the training programs which the CC is trying to do in terms of taking this Islamic finance proposition forward. George.
Great, Mushtak, thank you very much indeed. I must say it's been a really terrific day today. I've learnt so much, and I'd like to congratulate Mushtak and the organisers for putting on a wonderful event. I'm conscious I'm the tail end Charlie, and I will be very quick. I'm also, by background, an economist. Indeed, I used to work for the newspaper of that name, but I'm a reformed journalist, so you can trust me. Tell me anything you like, and you can trust me absolutely. I'm going to take a slightly different spin on the growth concept. We've talked quite a lot today about the growth in the supply of qualifications, of research, and so on. I'm going to look at how we might go think about increasing demand in Britain and elsewhere for our qualifications. Now, 10 years ago this very week, while Daud was busy in Kuala Lumpur setting up NCF in November 2005, I came here to Canary Wharf by bus, not from KL, but from Highbury in North London, where I live. The reason I know it was 10 years ago this week is that it was the same week as my wedding anniversary, which is still the same week this year. And it was in 2005, because Mushtak, as he mentioned, he and I have previous history. He and I were in the process of helping the launch of the Festival of Muslim Cultures 2016 and trying to raise some money for it from big banks here and so on. And I was conscious on the bus trip from Highbury in North London through the relatively poor, economically deprived boroughs of Dalston, Hackney, Tower Hamlets and so on, of coming towards this great sort of Xanadu, this pleasure palace, which is Canary Wharf, work and pleasure palace, which was, it looked almost inaccessible through the morning mist. In other words, there was this desperate economic poverty around the areas just north of here, and this huge place guarded then and still by private security guards, which looked completely inaccessible. Now, Daud's been very kind in praising the Islamic finance qualification. I was talking to a young American Lebanese woman the other day. You probably all know the story that Stanford used to be called the Harvard of the East. Now Harvard is called the Stanford of the West. And she described ANCF as being the Stanford of the Islamic finance world, which was meant genuinely as a great accolade. Dusty spoke this morning about pathways. His very first sentence was about pathways towards qualifications and work in finance. And in fact, our program, I have many copies of this here, is called Islamic Finance Qualifications Pathway, starting with our original Islamic finance qualification, and many people in this room have helped on this over the past 11 years since we started it and 9 years since we launched it. We've done a new one, which is a level 2 qualification, slightly underneath the existing one. And as Daud said, we're working on developing higher level qualifications. There'll be a gradual route towards better performance as people progress in their careers. Dusty spoke about pathways and about ways to hook people into our great profession. Sultan, who I think has just gone to avoid me, was talking about the importance of operational, functional competence. Now, obviously, as an institute, Islamic finance qualification is an important part of what we do, but we also do a wide range of other qualifications, and our strong feeling is that by matching some of these qualifications, both our qualifications and bankers and accountants, I'm also an accountant, although I've forgotten most of that, accountants, bankers, actuaries, lawyers and so on, many of these professional qualifications can be enhanced by Islamic finance qualifications to give people a better route to a very good career. Daud mentioned, and I'd love to have heard this talk last night, and I hope we can maybe get him to do it for us again sometime in the coming months in London, talked about education, perception and liquidity as being key issues in the development of of Islamic finance. He also talked about the lack of qualified people in Malaysia being a problem. I think, coming to something that Stella Cox said earlier, I think lack of opportunity is a big problem. Now, the sort of denouement of my bus trip through the barrier from Tower Hamlets into Docklands was a meeting with Citibank, who were hugely helpful in the months and indeed years after that in getting young people to come and see how a bank works, because a lot of people out there, youngsters, especially those in poorer areas, fear banks, accounting firms, law firms and so on. And it's interesting, for instance, in London, Daud's old firm Deloitte has spent a huge amount of effort these past few years in encouraging young people to come and spend some time at work. See what happens, maybe spend a few hours there, or 2 weeks in a structured training course, or 3 months maybe over summer during university to see how things work in practice. And that's been immensely helpful at pulling poor people or people from economically derived backgrounds into careers in our industry. We as an institute are very keen on modern apprenticeships. I'm not sure how many of you here have come across this concept, but essentially a modern apprenticeship is harking back to previous days when it was a perfectly acceptable business to leave school and go straight into work, have a proper apprenticeship, get a qualification, and maybe later on go to university. We've seen, all of us in Britain certainly, this frankly awful trend of young people leaving university with degrees which don't exactly make them very employable, with big student debts and being unemployed for years. Daud referred to himself earlier as a stealth weapon. We have our own stealth weapon, and I'm glad this isn't being televised or recorded, but our chairman is Alan Yarrow, Alderman Alan Yarrow, a former banker, former deputy chairman of Dresdner Bank globally. Stella Cox used to work with Alan. He's a tough man, but a wonderful man. He's this year's Lord Mayor. But we get him back at the end of this week when he stops being Lord Mayor. And one thing that Alan talks about, and it's not the sort of thing you expect a big-time investment banker and a Lord Mayor to talk about, is, if you like, generational austerity, the lost generation in Britain, not just young Muslims, but many young people who simply can't find a decent career. My own sons, for instance, both with very good honours degrees in mathematics from a very good university, took some years to find the right path, and now they've found it, and that's great. But we believe that, firstly, modern apprenticeships, which we've done in many cities around Britain and are now doing abroad, work very effectively for us as an institute. We see them as potentially, with our level 2 qualification, as a way into banking and finance for youngsters, particularly youngsters from a Muslim background who want to get into finance and maybe want to go to university later on. We're very keen to develop that program. A couple of people, Mushtak, you mentioned financial crime. We're just about to launch 2 new crime qualifications on, if you like, traditional old-fashioned crime and one on cybercrime. And we're working very closely with the Cabinet Office, the UK Government Cabinet Office, in developing an apprenticeship program for that. And who knows, that might well be a great opportunity to bring young people from communities around here in Birmingham and so on, and elsewhere in the world, into Islamic finance through a decent apprenticeship program. So I think we should, as well as thinking about the supply of excellent qualifications, there are many bodies in Britain and around the world which do that. I'd say led by NCF, frankly, in terms of quality and range of qualifications, but of course University of East London does a great job in giving people opportunities in this field. We've got to think about ways not just of giving people the right qualifications and background, but also the access to potential employment. We as a profession, a professional body, are like every other professional body. We see it as being 3 things: knowledge, the sort of knowledge you pick up in school, university, of the basics of what a demand and supply curve looks like, arithmetic from primary school and so on. The skills to apply that knowledge. In fact, the same young Lebanese woman's mother told me that the difference between skill and knowledge is that knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit. The skill is not to put it in the fruit salad. But the skill to apply the knowledge you've acquired to benefit your clients, your firm, yourself. And finally, behaviour. There has been much discussion today about the importance of integrity and ethics. And we as an institute and most other professional bodies regard personal behaviour as being absolutely vital in, frankly, bringing banks back from the brink. Since the financial crisis of 7 years ago, the big banks in Europe and North America have paid more than $300 billion in fines and recompenses. Now, that's a huge amount of money, and they're all aware that much has gone wrong. Virtually nothing's been paid, as far as I can see, by Islamic banks. They have been much more ethical, but there are risks. So knowledge, skills, and personal behaviour, very important to us, but bringing young people in and showing them what we do, simply, straightforwardly, showing people that banks aren't horrible, inaccessible towers, but places where people work hard and enjoy working hard. We see that as being important, and we are very keen as an institute, and our fellow institutes, both in Britain and around the world, are very keen as well to help in that process. I'll shut up now because time is running short.
Okay, thank you. No, thank you. Just on this question of integrity and that, I mean, management code of ethics is very, very important in any system. And I think Malaysia, if I'm not wrong, is the only country that has a code of ethics for Islamic bankers. And it's quite the punitive measures involved. You can fine, jail, and everything. And fortunately, only 1 or 2 have been found wanting, under this sort of code of ethics. I'm going to open the discussion now to the audience, and then I'll join in with some questions later. I think I'm going to give the audience. Okay, I'll come back to you in a minute, Iqbal. Can I have this gentleman here? And I want some questions from the ladies as well, and some more of the students as well, okay? So don't hold back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, at the beginning, I have to appreciate and thank the organizers of this conference. It has been very educative and informative. It is the first conference for me to attend in this Islamic finance. I'm a student, but I'm new to the field, doing my PhD, coming from law, my PhD with the Professor Siraj, but I'm looking at the issue of compliance. Actually, I want to make an observation as regards the work of the Sharia boards. The Sharia boards, what they're doing, I think, is ijtihad, or what they should be doing. Because, as it has been mentioned by various people here, that what we are doing today, it doesn't have to necessarily fit into what has been done by the jurists of the classic times, because our time is different from their time. We need to take the law and promote it to answer the needs, peculiar needs of our time. And this is the role of ijtihad. If we are doing that, certainly the results of our ijtihad should be different from what they did before, to be able to meet with our needs of the present time. So what they are doing is ijtihad. If they are doing ijtihad, certainly the result should be different. If the result is different, certainly they should tell the audience, the people, the general public, what are the evidences, what are the proof in Sharia for their results. Because the issue of compliance is very important. It forms the basis of our legitimacy of the Islamic financial institutions. And it answers almost all the problems we have discussed so far. The problem of capital, the problem of job creation, and so on, and collaboration. The majority of the Muslims, or the small-scale businesses, they don't patronage the Islamic Bank here in the UK. This is what I know. I lead a congregation of 10,000 people. Out of them, about 1,000 are running these restaurants businesses. But none of them is banking with Islamic Bank. Why? Because the concern goes to the issue of compliance. And the Islamic Bank itself complaining that people don't patronize it. So it is the issue of compliance. To address this issue of compliance, I think the Islamic board have to go further to explain what are the basis of their fatwa. I read the standards produced by IOFI. As mentioned by one professor here, they always approve. And also after the approval, the evidence they give, they said the madhab of Hanafi or the madhab of Maliki also has approved that, and this is the difference. And this is not ijtihad. Because the ijtihad is to draw from the text itself. The text remained the same today as it was at the earlier time. But the context differ. So therefore, they should explain what are the reasons, where they get it, but not to allude to what the other mazhab did. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was a question for the earlier session, but let me take it to the education, and especially in terms of your curriculum development. Maybe there should be a need to bring in a topic relating to ijtihad in the discourse of development of Islamic finance.
Yeah, I think this is just another example. Sorry, go ahead, Sheikh.
Question, actually, it's a very important question. I wish you asked when I was on the panel.
But you're back.
Just to summarize, you've mentioned the very important topic. To summarize, of course, what they are doing is ijtihad. And the IOFI standard is the summary of hundreds of research which been done by the scholars of the panel, which consists of around 200 scholars from different countries across the world. So what you read in the standard is not the evidence. It's just a summary or the summary of the summary. And if I were to go through the process, it takes every single standard around 3 years to be written. So what you see now is the summary of the summary for 3 years. So first, the scholar, or panel of scholars, actually 3 scholars will be asked to write about a topic, one of the needs which we have in the markets, for instance, sukuk, when it's started. Then scholars will write this, and then they will provide this to another panel, and they will read it, and then comment on it, and then it will be taken to the General Council of the Sharia Board, and then they will discuss it for 2-3 days, and then they will comment on it, and then revisit it again until it will take this process around 2 years. Every standard which you see, it takes more than 2 years to be published. And they will revisit it, as now we have in December, revisiting the standard of Sukuk standards. So it's not that simple as you are putting it. It's so simple, no one knows what's going on. No. If you were to ask the right people, they can tell you. We have plenty of evidences, plenty of research, plenty of, it's not just Hanafi Shafi'i. No, definitely not. We go beyond the Hanafi and the Shafi'i. We use sometimes 8 schools of thoughts. We go sometimes with no school of thought, but based on clear, good evidence which is relevant. So I can discuss this offline with you, but to put it in the right direction, we definitely have the evidences, we definitely have the research, we definitely have the scholar approval or the scholar's approval on that, which is very sophisticated. So this is why we need to ask the right people in order to understand what's going beyond the standards or beyond the fatwa. Similarly, we have on a different scale, when we have a fatwa on an issue in a bank or a Sharia board, we deliver just a one-page fatwa, but actually beyond that fatwa we have lengthy research. But we are not permitted to publish this because privacy of the bank and stuff relevant to that.
Sure. I was just going to ask you, very briefly, very quickly, is the fatwa public ownership or is intellectual property?
It is public ownership. There's no intellectual property as such unless it's related to a particular specifics of the bank or the product itself. This is why when you sign a contract, which is between the consultancy contract between you and the bank, you sign on the confidentiality clause. So you are binded to what they say. We can publish this, we can't publish that.
Okay.
Generally speaking, it is a public.
Okay, thanks.
I had 2 comments just very quickly on that. And I'm glad Sheikh actually answered the question. He answered it very eloquently. But 2 points. One is that it isn't well known that process goes on. I know it goes on, but it's not in the public domain. And I think we need to change perceptions around that, because the perception is that it's a sort of, it's a closed shop and it's completely ran. A lot of due process is there, but people aren't familiar that the process exists. At INSIF, in terms of our Sharia teaching, and it's an important part of our program because the foundation is Sharia, ijtihad is taught. And the various processes, but what we also teach is that you need to leave an audit trail in terms of the documentation. There has been talk in the past of creating a sort of fatwa database which ISRA is putting through. It's not just about the collection of all the fatwas, but it's actually the due process they've gone through, how that decision was reached, so you can actually share the knowledge. And in some ways, and forgive me for saying this, but I'm covering all bases here, that actually then takes away the exclusivity of some of the leading Sharia scholars, because actually it becomes much more common knowledge. We commented earlier, or there was a comment, that in 2005 Malaysia changed the process of the Sharia boards, where I think you indicated that a Sharia scholar could only be on one board. Initially that caused a problem because there was a shortage of Sharia scholars, but what it did do was catapult some of the more junior people who were studying under more senior people into a level of prominence, and they actually had to play catch up quickly. And now look what we've got. We've actually got a really good and robust strength in depth of Sharia scholarship, including many female scholars in Malaysia, and it's been to the benefit. Interestingly, a number of other countries like the UAE and even Qatar are considering implementing that model. Yeah.
Quickly, okay, then I'll go to the next question.
No, I just wanted to also point out that NCF's role has not been just in research and curriculum development, but knowledge exchange. I just want to say that when Daud talked about collaborations. This has been one of the benefits in terms of partnerships across the world, that they have learned a lot from the pioneering modules that you've had. I just want to say an example of another collaboration. I just want to point to Mr. Shabir Randiri, is, for example, reaching out to diplomats and UK ambassadors going abroad, where INCF and supported by UAL are launching, an executive training program. So these are interventions at various levels, and therefore it's quite clear not one institution, not one profession group can do that, but combining, as INCF does, as UAL tries to do, as Durham tries to do, that's a way forward.
Okay. Any further questions? Iqbal?
Thank you, Mushtak. I have a very basic question, and Siraj, you will appreciate that, and others will, of course. So if you look at World Bank figures, you see that only about 25% of the Muslim population is banked or has access to financial services, which means that with the best will in the world, we'll not be touching the majority of the Muslim population.
True.
If we continue as we are, okay? 75% will be untouched. So we need to have a serious strategy of financial inclusion. And when we started this journey in 2000, and Mushtak may be able to identify the person, senior Islamic banker, he said in a public meeting that Islamic finance is a movement for the wealthy middle-class Muslims. If that is so, they don't need your advice. They can easily source advice from everywhere else. So we haven't seen in any curriculum an idea of how to create financial inclusion. Now, at the University of East London, postgraduate course is, okay, I'm teaching one undergraduate course. Now, University of East London has a composition of students who are relatively from deprived backgrounds. And you can see that out of all the topics, the one on financial inclusion hits them, and they can really latch onto it and say, sir, how can I do this, and how can I do this, and this is interesting. So I think really we have a big responsibility to go for that 75 million. Many of them are not banking at all because they abhor interest bank financial institutions or whatever it is, right? And, like things like Islamic microfinance, which is fine, but we need to appreciate, and this is something which Professor Muhammad Yunus told me in 1983. I said to him, look, this 28% interest rate is riba. So he said, son, come sit down here. He showed me, he said, my delivery cost is 24%, all right? So I'm making 3% profit. Have you got a problem with that? Your Islamic banks are making 6% service charges. So that set me thinking that, and when I see Murabaha-based Islamic microfinance, it comes to the same thing. I don't think you can somehow vanish the costs into something else. However, you can enhance Islamic microfinance with micro-takaful, which, of course, improves the credit quality of the microfinance. And micro-takaful premiums, you can fund from zakat. Definitely in Shafi scholars, they are comfortable with that. Hanafi scholars are still prevaricating on this, but I'm sure we can talk to them and convince. So unless we have a credible financial inclusion strategy, we're not really talking to the mass of the Muslim people. 3 million Muslims in the UK is a drop in the ocean.
Well spoken, and one day I hope that when we speak about performance of Islamic finance, we talk about those targets. We talk about monitoring and evaluation, for which we need baselines, we need indicators. Landless, and it's well spoken, Iqbal.
We have to do the MDG type of
Absolutely.
benchmark.
So our development agenda is very key, and for Islamic finance to climb on the development agenda. We are speaking about that at the World Bank and other places.
I mean, we as Iqbal knows, and through our connection through the IMF and through Abbas Miracle and back to the World Bank, we're now in our second term of a research collaboration with the World Bank. We had a 2-year term which expired in April. It's been renewed for 5 years. And this is an area we're working on with them. But it needs to get down to the specificities. I struggle with that word. It's my language, but I can't even say the word. The specifics of this. It is actually setting some specific targets. Well, you'll be familiar with the Alexandria Business Association, where I did some work 3 or 4 years ago when I was first at INSIF. And the model you've just described of microfinance, Sharia compliant microfinance, micro-tokaful, it's an enormously successful model. Default rates are sort of, 0 point something %, and that can be funded, if you like, from zakat contributions or establishing waqf or whatever else. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they've set specific targets, and they're actually, meeting them. There are huge lessons to be learned from this, and I think it's the transfer of case studies, the information that's done. Stella, I think, was referring to a round table I chaired last week, closed door, where we were talking about a number of corporate social responsibility type instruments. We were clearly talking about the World Bank and their vaccination sukuk, but the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Malaysia, Khazanah, has come up with a CSR type sukuk which has improved education standards at primary schools and effectively is profitable, although the investors take a small haircut. I think they lose, how many basis points do you remember? Izani was saying it was 25, 30 basis points. It was quite low, but that was equivalent to their CSR contribution, but it was profitable. And these schools, which were sort of rated 4,500 in Malaysia, been set specific targets, and with this investment have improved to being, number 2,000 within 12 months. These are the specifics that we need to be focused on. Otherwise, it is generalizations. The idea that 75% of the Muslim world is living in poverty or hasn't got access to finance or whatever else is to me fundamentally un-Islamic. My understanding of the Quran, simple as it may be, and Sheikh Hatem, I apologize because I haven't learned Arabic, but I read the translation of it, is that so long as we have one person in poverty on the planet, Islam has failed. Our job is to ensure that there's an equal, a distribution where everybody has an opportunity and nobody's living in poverty, and that we have mechanisms whereby everybody can have a reasonably successul life. So we have a long way to go, but we're not going to tackle it unless we tackle specific problems and set specific targets.
Gentlemen, I am afraid we are reaching the end of our time. Just my closing remark very briefly on this one. The good professor, Yunus, I think he misses the point. You should look at Bank Islami model of microfinance and see how we can mitigate or do away with the interest aspect. But anyway, we have 3 spectacularly successful financial inclusion examples in Islamic finance, and nobody seems to talk about them. Number 1 is the MUIS, the Sukuk Waqf, the Waqf against Sukuk. I'm not going to go into detail because the other one is Tabung Haji.
Yeah.
And the third one is the Bank Rakyat, the cooperative bank in Malaysia, which is, in terms of assets, the single largest Islamic financial institution. So we don't seem to think,
Scaling up, replicating, and adopting in other jurisdictions.
We will have to ask why is that happening? But the examples are there, the efforts are there. And of course, this question of Rahnu, that is another area, microfinance. But one other area, two stakeholders can also push this agenda, the policymakers and also the standard setters. Now, the policymakers, let me talk about the South African sukuk very briefly. South African sukuk to date is the only sukuk request for proposal which included a social inclusion clause. That means they forced the international big banks, the BNPs and all these, to team up with a local black empowerment institution so that they could pass the knowledge of structuring sukuk.
Sure.
So no other country, and it took a non-Muslim country like South Africa to innovate that. So I would like to see more of those sort of innovation. But I think the IFSB also has a role to play here, to come up with standards. I always have this gripe with Jassim. It's the mandate. He always hides behind the mandate. I can't do this because I said, for God's sake, things like financial inclusion should be a very, very important, given what's happening after the financial crisis. The other thing is authorization model for Islamic finance, for Islamic banks. If we have that standard, then at least wherever you go in the world, you can be confident that the bank that has been set up there has got these certain basics, and it gives certainty and confidence to the sector. I'm afraid we are reaching the end because I'm having all people sort of reminding me. What I'm going to do is just basically, not even a summing up, but just give you a pointer for what's going to happen next. You know. First of all, I'm glad to say that the proceedings of today's seminar or conference will be published in the form either of a report or a book or a journal. So you can look forward to receiving it. And for what it's worth, they've asked me to do it. So I'll try my best to inculcate all the views and the issues and all that. So hopefully we will, the university will let you know when that will be available. So that is something to take away. So you can look forward to, reviving some of the thinking and the issues. The other thing is this is the first, if you like, conference in a series of 3, which the University of East London and also Shabir's Islamic Finance Advisory Group here are planning. So the next one will take place, I think, in the first quarter of next year, and it will bring together the various educators in Islamic finance in this country so that you can have a real powwow, real indaba, as we say in South Africa, about the issues and how we take this forward in the different areas that have come up today. So in discipline, in curricula, in talent development, critical thinking, outside the box, and financial inclusion in all these areas. And then there will be a third conference as well, specifically aimed at the students, to get their feedback, to get their interaction, to give them a chance to speak for themselves, to put it in bluntly. Well, I think we are looking forward to this sort of series, and I'm very grateful to the university and to Shabir for championing this and supporting these efforts. And I think it's very, very important in this. If we get it right, it could be something which we can export to other countries as well in terms of this interactive sort of engagement between various stakeholders in the industry. So I will leave you with that and call upon Professor Siraj to give the closing remarks, and I assume the vote of thanks as well.
Thank you very much, Mushtak. First of all, I should thank you because you have been not just a chair, but in fact have guided the proceedings, a very rich tapestry of views and so on and so forth. But I should have first begun by thanking the organizers, because this is a very different model, as you must have seen, by Neil Stewart and Associates. I must thank Neil Stewart itself, Karen Stewart, Katrina Wright, Nick Bond, and Paul Rushworth, who quite invisibly made all this happening, the logistical as well as all the little needs. It's been a privilege on behalf of the Center for Islamic Finance, Law and Communities to host this. But really, all thanks goes to Nora Colton, our Deputy Vice Chancellor, who has been really a champion and driving force, not for the university alone, but in collaborations. It is because of her efforts that you will see that there's not just University of East London, but you'll see that INCF, of course, a global leader in its own right, you'll see Durham, but a variety of other institutes and universities that are there, and students, not just from UEL, but students from half a dozen universities doing the doctoral studies, the future of Islamic finance tomorrow. But perhaps, the driving force, and I've used this term before, has really been another partner. And that is, of course, Mr. Shabir Andiri, who, despite being perhaps the busiest person in this room, has chosen to stay till the end of it, driving this particular process. And of course, he represents the Islamic Finance Advisory Board, all the members who are here, who contributed over here. So I think the outcome of today's proceedings is, first of all, the fact that we have a dialogue going, and we're looking forward, Mushtaq, to you producing this set of actions, recommendations. But the message is all positive. If you remember what Sultan Chowdhury said, he said, listen, the challenge was even greater when we started off. He was looking at Shabir and others. We survived, we grew, we thrived, we innovated, and we brought it over here. And he said, the future is in fact quite promising as we expand and as we build on the collaborations and the leadership of many people. So could I just say, I hope I haven't left anybody out. I know that at University of East London, whether it be the Vice Chancellor, John Joggin, who was supposed to be over here, or Dusty Amuriwala, who came over here, John Hadley, who was there at the dinner, I would like to say that this has been a privilege working with all of these sponsors. I'd like to particularly mention FAA, CISI, NCF, and all the others for being over here and supporting this. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you again and staying in touch. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.